Winter 1943, somewhere outside Moscow, temperature minus 38 degrees Celsius. A Soviet tank battalion prepares for a critical dawn offensive. The T-34 cruise veterans who've driven back the men who pride themselves on toughness and disdain for comfort climb into their tanks and turn the ignition. Nothing. The diesel fuel has turned to gel. The engines are frozen solid across the assembly area. 30 T-34s sit silent and useless, transformed from weapons of war into metal coffins that won't even start. But there's movement in the American sector. The hated Lend-Lease Shermans tanks Soviet crews have been mocking for months as soft capitalist toys with their heated crew compartments and unnecessary winterization kits are firing up one by one. Their crews didn't sleep beside bonfires all night trying to keep engines warm. They didn't pour boiling water over frozen parts. They just pressed the starter and the engines turned over. The luxury features that Red Army tankers dismissed as weakness are about to become the only reason this offensive happens at all. And the lesson Soviet commanders are learning is brutal. Sometimes what looks like comfort is actually the difference between an army that fights and an army that freezes. The full story. When Soviet pride met American engineering reality. The arrival of American Lend-Lease Sherman tanks in the Soviet Union during 1942 and 1943 was greeted with reactions ranging from grudging acknowledgement to outright contempt by Red Army tank crews. These were men who had fought their way back from the edge of annihilation during Operation Barbarossa, who had stopped the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, using T-30 for medium tanks that Soviet propaganda celebrated as the world's finest armored vehicles. The T-34 had earned its legendary status through brutal combatives. Sloped armor could deflect German shells. Its wide tracks provided excellent mobility in mud and snow. And its 76mm gun could knock out most German tanks it encountered. Soviet tankers had learned to trust their T-34s with their lives, and they took intense pride in both the machine and their own toughness in operating it under the most extreme conditions imaginable. So when American M4 Sherman tanks began arriving via Arctic convoys and the Iranian corridor, Soviet crews examined them with critical eyes and found much to disdain. The Sherman's armor was thinner than the T-34's, arranged in less sophisticated angles that Soviet tankers knew made it more vulnerable to German anti-tank guns. Its 75mm gun was adequate but not notably superior to Soviet armament. Its profile was taller, making it a bigger target. But what really drew Soviet scorn were the creature comforts that American engineering had built into the Sherman features that seemed to Soviet tankers like unnecessary luxuries born from a soft, capitalist culture that didn't understand real warfare. The Sherman had an auxiliary generator that provided electrical power for interior, lighting, and equipment when the main engine was off. It had engine heaters and winterization systems. The crew compartment was relatively spacious compared to the cramped T-34 interior. There were hatches and vision ports that made crew operations easier. The transmission was more reliable and easier to maintain. Two Red Army tankers who'd been fighting in conditions of unimaginable hardship. These features seemed like the marks of an army that didn't understand serious combat. Soviet crews slept in their tanks or in the open in sub-zero weather. They started their T-34s by building fires under the engine to warm the oil, or by draining the oil each night, heating it over fires, and pouring it back in before starting the engine in the morning. They operated in darkness because running generators wasted fuel needed for combat. They endured cramped, uncomfortable crew positions because that's what war demanded. The idea that Americans would waste weight, complexity, and resources on crew comfort struck many Soviet tankers as proof that the United States didn't understand the Eastern Front's brutal realities. Real tankers didn't need heated compartments or convenient hatches. They needed thick armor, a big gun, and the toughness to endure whatever conditions warfare imposed. This attitude was reinforced by Soviet military culture, which glorified hardship and viewed comfort with suspicion. The Red Army had been forged in the Russian Civil War's chaos, shaped by Stalin's purges and hardened by the Great Patriotic War's existential struggle. Suffering was expected, even celebrated, as proof of dedication and revolutionary spirit. Complaints about conditions were seen as weakness, potentially even politically suspect. In this cultural context, American tanks, with their soft features, seem to reflect capitalist decadence rather than sound military engineering. Some Soviet crews derisively called the Shermans a grave for four brothers because of their height and perceived vulnerability. But the winter of 1943-44 taught Soviet tankers a lesson that pride and propaganda couldn't overcome. Operational availability matters more than theoretical superiority. The Eastern Front experienced winters of legendary brutality temperatures that routinely dropped to -30 or -40 Celsius, sometimes even colder. At these temperatures, the mechanical challenges of operating armored vehicles became as dangerous as enemy fire. Diesel fuel, which Soviet T-34s used, has a higher gel point than gasoline thickens and eventually solidifies in extreme cold, making it impossible to pump through fuel lines or burn in engines. Engine oil becomes viscous, almost solid, creating such resistance that starter motors can't turn the engine over. Rubber seals become brittle and crack metal contracts, creating gaps in seals and fittings. Batteries lose most of their power. The moisture in a tank crew's breath freezes on every interior surface, covering controls and instruments with ice. Soviet T-34 crews had developed brutal workarounds for these problems, but they required enormous effort and preparation. The standard procedure for winter operations was to never let the tank get completely cold if you could avoid it. Crews would start their engines every few hours throughout the night to keep the oil warm and the engine from freezing solid. This consumed fuel, wore out engines, and meant someone had to stay awake through freezing nights to maintain the starting schedule. If an engine did get cold, crews had to build fires underneath the tank to heat the oil panna. Dangerous procedure that risks setting the entire vehicle ablaze if done incorrectly. Alternatively, they could drain the oil while it was still warm, keep it heated overnight near a fire, and pour it back into the engine in the morning before attempting to start. This required carrying extra containers, maintaining fires, and performing mechanical work in darkness and sub-zero conditions while wearing heavy gloves that made fine work nearly impossible. These procedures were time-consuming, exhausting, and operationally limiting. A tank battalion planning a dawn offensive had to begin preparations the night before, with crews working in shifts to keep engines running or maintain fires. The process consumed fuel that would otherwise be available for combat operations. It required time that could have been spent on maintenance, rest, or tactical preparation. And it wasn't always successful as spy crews' best efforts. T-34s would regularly fail to start on winter mornings. Their engines frozen or their batteries too depleted to turn over cold-thickened oil. A battalion that planned to attack with 30 tanks might find only 20 actually able to move when the assault began. The others sat as frozen metal sculptures, operationally useless until temperatures rose or until crews could spend hours heating them back to life. The American Shermans arriving via Lend-Lease came equipped with winterization systems that Soviet engineers had considered unnecessary luxuries. The Sherman's gasoline engine was somewhat easier to start in cold weather than diesel. But more importantly, the tank came with an auxiliary generator and engine heater system. The auxiliary generator could run independently of the main engine, providing electrical power for the crew compartment, and critically, for engine heaters that kept the main engine oil and coolant warm enough to allow starting even in extreme cold. The system was designed based on American experience with mechanized equipment in Alaska and cold weather testing programs that had identified exactly which components needed protection from freezing temperatures. The winterization package included insulated battery boxers, heated fuel lines, special cold weather lubricants, and engine block heaters that could maintain minimum operating temperature without running the main engine continuously. Soviet crews, who deep in assigned Shermans and had initially resented them, began to notice something during the first serious cold snap of winter 1943. Their tanks started in the morning when T-34s didn't. Sherman crews could sleep through the night Chixley sleep, not take shifts, maintaining engine temperature, and when morning came, they pressed the starter, and their engines turned over. They didn't spend hours building fires, heating oil, or coaxing frozen machinery to life. They did unwatch helplessly as planned. Offensives were delayed because half the battalionese tanks would unstart. The luxury of crew comfort that Soviet tankers had mocked turned out to be operational readiness that commanders desperately needed. A Sherman with its heaters and winterization systems had perhaps 95% probability of starting on a winter morning. A T-34 without those systems, no matter how superior its armor and gun, had perhaps 60 or 70% probability end. That was with crews working all night to improve the odds. The operational implications became stark during winter offensives, when timing was critical. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized concentrated armored thrusts supported by artillery and infantry operations that required tanks to be in position at specific times to exploit prepared artillery strikes or to catch German forces off balance. When half your tank force couldn't start because of cold weather, the entire operation was compromised. Attack! Timings slipped. Concentrations of force dissolved as only some units could advance. Artillery preparation was wasted when the tanks that were supposed to exploit it sat frozen in assembly areas. German defenders also suffering from cold weather, but often in prepared positions with access to heated shelters and maintenance facilities, had time to react and reinforce. Offensives that should have achieved breakthrough and exploitation stalled because the tanks needed to maintain momentum were still being heated back to operational status hours after the attack was supposed to begin. Soviet commanders, whatever their ideological prejudices about American capitalism, were pragmatists who cared about results. They began requesting more Shermans specifically because of their cold weather reliability. After action reports started noting that Sherman-equipped units maintained higher operational readiness rates during winter than T-34 units, Tank Corps commanders learned to position their Sherman battalions in roles where reliability mattered more than maximum armor protection exploitation forces that needed to move quickly once breakthrough was achieved. Mobile reserves that had to respond rapidly to developing situations or units designated for dawn attacks, where starting reliability was crucial. The Americans' soft features translated directly into tactical advantages that no amount of superior armor or firepower could offset if your tanks would unstart. Individual tankers' attitudes shifted as experience overrode prejudice. Veterans who de-scorned the Sherman S-heated crew compartment discovered that crews who were UNT frozen from spending the night trying to keep an engine warm were more alert, more effective in combat, and less prone to mistakes caused by exhaustion and cold. The spacious interior that had seemed wasteful turned out to make crew operations faster and more efficient. The reliable transmission that American engineers had designed for ease of maintenance meant Sherman spent less time deadline for repairs. The improved vision ports and crew hatches that seemed like unnecessary complexity made it easier for crews to maintain situational awareness and escape from damaged vehicles. Feature by feature, the American design choices that Soviet tankers had interpreted as capitalist luxury revealed themselves as thoughtful engineering solutions to real operational problems. The comparison became particularly stark during major winter offensives, like the operations to relieve Leningrad in early 1944, or the massive summer offensive Operation Progression, which began after spring thaw, but whose planning was influenced by winter lessons. Soviet planners had to account for the reality that T-34 units would have lower operational readiness than Sherman units in cold weather, which meant allocating resources differently, more reserve tanks to compensate for frozen equipment, more time for preparation, or more reliance on units with better cold weather equipment. The Sherman's operational reliability in winter became a strategic factor, not just a tactical convenience. Lend-Lease Shermans, whatever their shortcomings in armor or armament, compared to T-34s or later Soviet designs, could be counted on to start and fight when needed, which made them valuable assets that commanders requested specifically. The broader lesson extended beyond tanks to American military equipment. Generally, Soviet forces receiving American trucks, jeeps, aircraft, and other Lend-Lease equipment initially approached them with skepticism colored by ideology and pride. But practical combat experience tended to overcome prejudice. American Studebaker trucks became the preferred logistics vehicles because they were reliable and easy to maintain. Willys Jeeps were prized for their versatility and durability. Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters, rejected by American and British pilots as inadequate, became favorites of Soviet aviators, who discovered they were perfectly suited to Eastern Front combat conditions. The pattern was consistent. American equipment designed with crew comfort, ease of maintenance, and reliability as priorities often outperformed Soviet equipment that prioritized maximum combat performance at the expense of those soft factors. The cultural clash this represented was profound. Soviet military culture, shaped by communist ideology and the brutal experiences of revolution and civil war, glorified sacrifice, hardship, and the triumph of will over material conditions. The idea that making things easier for crews or building inconveniences was legitimate engineering rather than weakness ran counter. Two deeply held beliefs about what made soldiers effective. American military culture, shaped by industrial capitalism, and a different set of national experiences approached equipment design as an optimization problem, where crew efficiency, maintenance, burden, and operational reliability were legitimate engineering objectives equal in importance to raw combat performance. Neither approach was universally superior. Each had strengths and weaknesses, but the winter tank starting issue starkly illustrated that dismissing crew comfort as luxury could translate directly into operational failure. The post-war Soviet tank development program absorbed some of these lessons, though not always explicitly. Later Soviet tank designs incorporated better crew ergonomics, more reliable cold weather starting systems, and more attention to maintainability, though they never fully adopted American levels of crew comfort. The experience of watching T-34s sit frozen while Sherman studded reliably had taught Soviet designers that operational readiness was a combat multiplier that could unbe dismissed as capitalist softness. The T-54 55th series that became the Soviet Union's main battle tank for decades reflected some of these lessons. With improved crew conditions and better cold weather reliability than earlier designs, even if Soviet tanks never matched American standards for crew comfort, for the individual Soviet tankers who lived through the winter of 1943-44, the lesson was personal and immediate. The Americans they'd been taught to view as soft capitalists had designed tanks that worked when Soviet tanks did UNT, not because of superior armor or guns, but because American engineers had taken seriously the problem of keeping machinery operational in extreme conditions. The heated crew compartments that seemed like luxury kept crews alert and effective. The engine heaters that seemed unnecessary turned out to be the difference between tanks that fought and tanks that sat frozen. The reliable transmissions and easier maintenance meant more time in combat and less time in repair facilities. Feature by feature, the luxury revealed itself as combat effectiveness, and the mockery turned to grudging respect, and then to specific requests for more of those reliable American tanks. The broader historical irony is that both nations' approaches produced effective military forces. The Soviet Union's emphasis on toughness and operational sacrifice enabled the Red Army to endure catastrophic losses and keep fighting. America's emphasis on crew efficiency and equipment reliability enabled the U.S. military to maintain high operational tempos with lower casualty rates. The Sherman's winterization systems weren't inherently superior to Soviet cold weather procedures. They were different engineering solutions to the same problem. And in the specific case of tank starting reliability in extreme cold, the American solution worked better. Soviet tankers who learned that lesson firsthand, shivering through nights, trying to keep T-34 engines from freezing while Sherman crews slept in heated compartments, came to appreciate that sometimes the line between luxury and necessity depends entirely on the temperature outside and whether your tank starts when you need it to fight.